Okay, cool. Okay. So not that dramatic. You just missed like the sort of very sort of polite introductory words, but sincerely, I think it's an intellectual endeavor that we haven't, tried in that way yet in Paris. Yeah. And it's also in that sense kind of a joint venture because Christiane has traveled all the way from Erfurt to come here. For everybody knowing Deutsche Bahn, you know that this is very risky and it's in the middle of the term. Yeah. So normally we should have been doing that in Geisa, but that would have been even more complicated for people to go, which is why we ended up in Fulda. Okay, coming back to the topic. So this book sort of summarizes really literally, I think, 10, 15 years of my work on democracy in the European Union. Okay, I just need to get the presentation to work, and it does. And I'll start by the question, why should we democratize the European Union? I will then talk about what demos building means and why should we talk about European identity. And will then present the approach of the empirical study and present some selected results and conclusions, like a good academic presentation. And I think really in the conclusions and the comparative study and the results, this is where the potential for interdisciplinary debate is. Okay, so why does the European Union need to be democratized? That's an ages-old question in EU studies. And what I present here is my normative position. There would be other EU scholars that will see things differently. My claim is that the EU has still certain democratic deficit, even though it's a strongly developed trans and supranational democratic polity. But the EU intervenes a lot into citizens' everyday life. We have intensive Europeanization, so European integration leading to losses of competencies in the nation states. And the democratic substance on the EU level is not as good as it used to be in the nation states. That's sort of why, in a nutshell, we need to democratize the European Union further. I think my students who would have a good deal to tell on that, because we study European integration in the EU institutional system, and we sort of end up discussing those questions all the time. So democratization regards institutions, processes and procedures, and obviously also citizens' activity, which is sort of mainly my purpose. So let me explain why citizen activity. That's sort of a thick concept of what democracy is, even in EU studies and especially in political science. So normally a political science concept of what democracy is would be institutions, processes, and procedures. So if we have representative democratic institutions and elections, that's already very nice. If we have citizens' initiatives on top of it, that's already a lot. And citizen activity doesn't like really figure in most political science models. My take on democracy obviously is that it should be sort of a strong democracy. So democracy needs to be carried by the citizens, and that means we need citizen activity. Citizen activity depends on a feeling of the EU citizens that sort of is termed a demos. So they need to see themselves as a demos, as a democratic subject. Here's the working definition of what I understand as a demos. A democratic subject that defines itself as such to a minimum extent. Let's take the example of the European elections. So when you're just like a formal EU citizen, you don't have the tendency, or you wouldn't have the tendency to participate in the EU elections because it seems to be like really distant. So that would be, if I don't feel concerned, why should I participate in the elections? So in order to make citizens even participate in elections, you need to have a kind of minimum level of interest and a sort of attachment to a certain polity. Otherwise, it won't work. And there's a there are really truckloads of books and articles in EU integration studies why this is a problem in the European Union, because not so many EU citizens have such a strong feeling of identification with the EU. So people should identify as EU citizens, they should identify with the European Union, and they should be politically active with regard to the EU, participating in elections, participating in citizen initiatives, feeling concerned as an EU citizen. And this is what the cipher democratic identity stands for. So when I ask after European identity, I ask after this. And when it comes to democratizing the EU, I'm looking at sort of the second way, which is demos building and citizens activity. I'm not in this book looking so much at the institutions, processes, and procedures. That's sort of the other path of EU democratization. Okay, then how does democratization relate to politicization? That's another hot topic in EU studies in the last 10 years, the politicization of European integration. Politicization of European integration means that European integration used to be kind of an allied-driven process. So big men, mostly men, doing big politics in the European Council were building the EU as a polity. And then suddenly something happens and the EU is politicized. So nasty right-wing populists start to build EU skepticism, which is indeed sort of one way of politicizing the EU. But obviously what I have just been explaining is also EU politicization. There can be a kind of positive, supportive EU politicization, saying the EU is my thing, I want to be engaged in the EU. So I think Pulse of Europe, for instance, would be a prime example of a kind of positive EU politicization. But still, the relation of politicization and democratization is an ambiguous one, because politicization doesn't necessarily mean democratization. It can mean the opposite, which is why a lot of EU scholars are afraid of politicization. There would be many colleagues that would say, okay, you talk about politicization, do you want the alternative for Germany discussing the EU and having a German exit or something? Yeah. And really, it's tricky, because politicization means critique. So critique and open debate is obviously a core condition for making a democracy work. But obviously, when you invite critique, it can be negative critique. It can even be destructive critique. So when you want sort of the citizens to be engaged, it doesn't mean they will do what sort of the elects accept them to do. I try to put the possible relations in 4 scenarios that I will briefly present, because it's not the main thing, but briefly. Politicization can sort of come from the bottom up, meaning citizens discussing the European Union, an increase in public perception and participation. Citizens participate, engage, politicize issues, and that leads to a stronger integration and to a stronger identification with the European Union. So basically, let's call it the Pulse of Europe model. Yeah, the more sort of we get engaged bottom up in the European Union, the more there is talk about the EU, and that sort of contributes to making democracy work in the EU. There's also another positive scenario that comes more from the top down, and that is mainly based on party political activities. So let's take the EU election campaigns. Many parties had rallies, many parties had meetings. In Frankfurt, there were like big parties where you could win prizes, where you could do things. So political parties try to mobilize citizens to participate in the EU elections and to get concerned. This is not a bottom-up activity, so it's not necessarily the citizens themselves that make an NGO, but it's EU sort of engagement, it's EU participation, and it's obviously also democratizing. So because the more citizens get involved in sort of shaping the European Union, discussing the European Union, the better for democracy, because this is democratic activity. But then there can be a bottom-up obstacle scenario, and my case here would be Brexit. Yeah, so in Brexit you had, well, it was bottom-up, but it was also top-down. So you had agents politicizing the European Union exactly in the way that my colleagues warned against. Let's politicize the European Union, but we politicize against it. So you had arguments like, every day Britain pays the value of a hospital to the European Union, for instance. So people then got upset. People were saying, we don't want to be a member in this European Union. We want the hospital for ourselves. So why should we give the equivalent of the cost of a hospital to Brussels? We don't want to do that. This came from the top down, so from the United Kingdom Independence Party, but this also sort of came from the bottom up, because a lot of citizens sort of were active in protesting against the European Union. And there are really several protests against the European Union here and there. So it doesn't, again, mean that this is not democratic. It's perfectly legitimate. It just means that it's not exactly enhancing European integration. Yeah. And then there is obviously also a scenario where politicization can openly work against democracy, and that would be what most right-wing populists do when they would say that what we are having is not democracy, it's a fake democracy. So vote for us and we'll give you the right democracy. And that's obviously kind of a, anti-democratic politicization, because the sort of the political parties themselves would be classified as anti-democratic. It's nice, I'm a political scientist. We have that toolbox of classifying activities. So it's not like really clear what comes out if we politicize. Coming back to European identity, I have to bother you a bit with the theoretical and conceptual framework before I come to the findings. So there are often taken for granted ideas of European identity. And I think what I have been saying about politicization already underlines that things are in flux. So European identity is not the identity. Especially Germans ask, so I often get these interview questions, Professor, where can a European identity come from? What should we do? And there is no such thing as a collective identities, because identities are always collectively socially constructed, meaning they are changeable, meaning they are not given. They are not geographically fixed. They are marked by complex arrangements of belonging. They have an individual component, a micro level. So I feel German because something sort of on my individual value orientation, my individual identifications makes me identify as a German. And they have a collective component. Looking at the Germans in the room, there's sort of something that we share or might not share. But if we share something, then this is sort of what creates the collective identity. Sociologist Benedict Anderson called collective identities imagined communities. And I think that's the label that we have to look for here. So we are not looking like something that is prefixed. We are not looking for something that is ahistorical. We are looking for something that is socially constructed. We are looking for the European imagined community that we need to make democracy work. What I did in this book is to investigate empirically how the three go together. So how politicization, so the raising a debate about the European Union, went together with identity construction and democratization. That's sort of the major. So how do these dynamics relate? We see on the micro level that there is some kind of basic European identities, because the majority of EU citizens supports EU integration and have a kind of an unspecific identification with the EU. So that changes a bit over the years, but in general, 50% of the population or a bit more would say we feel as Europeans. Meaning also that the rest doesn't feel as Europeans, and meaning also that this differs a lot as according to the countries. So whereas the Luxembourgeois, they will be pro-Europeans with 75% of the population. Greece in the moment has the red lantern. So Greece, since the financial crisis, I think has only 40% of the population that have kind of a positive EU image or would identify with the EU. So there are differences according to nationality, socioeconomic context, and levels of education, because people like me, professor of EU studies, benefited from Erasmus, benefited from Jean Monnet, benefited from Marie Curie. So I'm obviously a convinced European because Europe is good for me. So I go to Brussels with my students next week. People who don't profit from Europe obviously would identify less with the European Union. But citizens do not know much about the EU. So they have a kind of unspecific knowledge that the EU as such is a good thing, but they don't really know what the EU is. So that's interesting. Then there is the collective level. It's the patterns of meaning. So, and here we know that European identity is constructed in discourses. It plays on definitions of us and them, meaning, and that's, I think, very interesting in the Fulda context, it plays on what is European and what is non-European. So what is the EU inside and what is the outside? Very importantly, national and European identities are related in discourses. So it's very rare that people would just say, I'm a European, or Europe should do. It's often in relation. I'm French and European, but. Yeah. So that means that the meanings of Europe are contingent and controversial. They are sort of discussed in discourse. And when we talk about EU identity formation, we talk about I was going to say a pudding. So what would that be in English? So a wobbly thing that we try to nail to the wall. It's like really difficult to grasp. If we have some parameters of what will shape European identity, we don't exactly know how it goes about. And that was sort of where I came in with an empirical work. And these are sort of the two questions, and I'm really going to talk a little bit about both of them. The first question was, how do national European discourses construct Europe and the European Union via the quality press? And how are these discourses shaped and influenced by the specific national contexts? Okay, that's another technical definition that I will sort of be like really quick on. It's sufficient to say that discourse analysis is a field that is marked by some common methodological assumptions, but that besides these common assumptions, there's diversity in theories, methods, categories, and techniques. So here's a hint to the PhD students in the room. I was just thinking, I read 3 books on discourse analysis and then I write my methods chapter. I did the contrary. I read like 20 books on discourse analysis and 50 articles on discourse analysis, and then I built my own research design, because there is not one discourse analytical research design. But what is at stake is that we are after specific and interrelated events and practices that construct meaning. So this is sort of what I'm looking at. And I did one central assumption for the interested. I was systematically studying context. Most discourse analysts don't do that. They don't look at the context. So that was something that I did systematically. My first case was kind of sort of an extreme case, the French discourse preceding the referendum on the constitutional treaty in 2005. So it's probably the second most prominent case of a no against the European Union, because the French voted no against the constitutional treaty in 2005. The French were a founding member state. It was very narrow. It was 51% and something of a no vote, but the French voted against ratification of the EU constitutional treaty. That came as a shock. Yeah. And as the second case, I took the other part of the big founding members of the engine, the motors of European integration, the German discourse preceding the ratification of the constitutional treaty in the German Bundestag and Bundesrat in 2005. So I really wanted to see how those democratization, those things, European identity, were debated in those events. So and obviously you would have thought this was a debate about a constitutional treaty, so there probably was a lot of debate. So people will probably have been discussing what is European identity. So I have obviously chosen those cases because I thought there will be a lot of debate about what makes European identity. Not really. So it's a huge corpus, really a lot of articles that I analyzed. And here again, I think what stands out is that I tried to grasp the conservative to the far left political spectrum. And that was really very interesting. Usually those studies only look at one newspaper per country. But what was really interesting here was to have really the conservative to the far left spectrum, because you could really see how the discourse developed. As you will see, I'll explain that in an example. Again, very briefly, I looked after 8 dimensions of a discourse that I don't think I really have to explain in full detail. I think it will be clarified when I come to the findings. Yeah, I tried to sort of line out the patterns of the discourse in various steps. And what I will present in the results is mainly what are the rules of the discourse, which arguments were dominant, how and why do they succeed. And again, that's a bit theoretical now. I think it will become clearer when I tell you finally what came out. Because now I think we can jump to the conclusions or to the findings. So the first question is, who were the actors of the discourse? Who shaped those discourses? And I found out that in Germany, it was really an elite discourse. EU and national politicians and journalists and experts. So when you remember my criteria on democratization, forget about it. There were barely any citizens. So it was an expert discourse. I don't know, constitutional lawyers discussing in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung about the benefits or the challenges that were in the EU Constitutional Treaty. Citizens, that was very interesting, were writing letters to the editor, Leserbriefe, saying we are not asked, which was, I'm sorry to say that, but it was exactly true. Citizens weren't involved. There was no public debate. And just to give you an example how not public it was, the two leading German politicians of that time, so Chancellor Schröder and Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer, they didn't speak publicly. Die hatten keine öffentlichen Auftritte in Germany, but they had public appearances in France and in Spain. So Joschka Fischer and Gerhard Schröder traveled to Spain and to France to speak in favor of the constitutional treaty, but in Germany, zero. No debate. There was just no debate. That was like really, really striking for me, and I didn't understand it. In France, the total opposite. A strong bottom-up component. EU critical politicization. So citizens, NGO activists, trade unions, drivers of the discourse, united, politicized the constitutional treaty, and mobilized in what sort of then became the no vote, because they mobilized against the constitutional treaty. I'll tell you why in a minute. So the referendum discourse is seen as the most decisive politicization of the EU that ever took place in France. So never, ever did the French discuss as much about the European Union as in 2005, which is good. We want that. Yeah, it's a criterion of politicization and democratization. And I can tell you that the citizens really, genuinely debated the EU. It's just that in the end, the majority decided we don't like this constitutional treaty. And again, let me say, fair enough. So if you give people a vote, and if they vote no, then they vote no. You have to accept that. Yeah, democracy is not when you like the results, you as the elites. So it's a key finding that the French discourse was decided by a bottom-up tendencies, where the citizens, the NGO activists, the trade union representatives, it was the public debate coming from the bottom up that decided what happened in the French discourse. And that was like really very striking. There were also rules of the discourse. And again, so if that is sort of shocking, in France, everything could be said. So there was a traditional left-right divide that was marking the discourse very strongly. There was a new divide between a yes and no camp. I think if we think about certain public debates in the moment, we see sort of similar divides. When everything is just black and white, you are either for or against a certain camp, and no gray zones are possible. So the French debate in 2005 was very much like that. So all politicians had to publicly commit. Are you for the constitutional treaty or are you against? When you were from a left party, when you were, for instance, a moderate green and you were for the constitutional party, you were a traitor for the opponents. Yeah? Sort of the same the other way around. And that was really, really very harsh. So the debate was really, I mean, Twitter didn't exist in 2005, but it's really very similar to what we sometimes see on Twitter today. In Germany, everything was much more smooth. Basically, all politicians except the left party agreed in the support of the constitutional treaty, but they didn't voice it. They were silent. And what was really most striking in Germany was this sort of so-called silencing strategy, because some people spoke out against this constitutional treaty, and you could really see how they were silenced in the discourse. Also man konnte sehen, wie das erstickt wurde. So there were arguments against the constitutional treaty, but they just didn't have repercussions. Yeah. Stellen Sie sich vor, es ist eine Debatte und niemand führt sie. So the debate just ended. It hung in the air. Then another finding is that France was really making a clear us and them division, where France was us and the EU and other member states were them or the others. So that was also very striking. The French debate was not Europeanized. So the French were talking about the French. How do we, the French, see this constitutional treaty? Whereas in Germany, there was a strong reference. This is about the EU is us, so it's about our future. But the Germans were very interested in what happened in France. So this is very interesting for some students of EU public space. So because the Germans wanted to know what happened in France. So why are those French against the constitutional treaty? What is happening there? So you see a lot of debate in Germany popping up because in France something was happening. For a German, it was unbelievable why those French were against the constitutional treaty. So the discourses were strongly related. In terms of the European public space, that's kind of a positive sign. Then here are, I think, some reasons on why the discourses were so different. That's the look at the discourse contexts. So when we look at what European integration did to the German political system, then we see that it did do nothing, barely anything at all. It didn't change the German political system. Germany is a federal state, so it fits very nicely with the European Union. So European integration is not exactly a threat. There were not so many parts of the German political system that lost because of European integration. In France, it's the contrary. France is a centralized state. France really sort of thinks that sovereignty is very important. France also traditionally has a centralized, strong welfare state. And basically, this was destroyed because of European integration and liberalization. So the French have a lot to reproach against the European Union, not so much the Germans. In Germany, also traditionally, there are barely any EU protest parties. So I'm tempted to say that even Alternative for Germany is not an EU protest party. Even sort of they say we want to be in the European Parliament, but to change the European Parliament. They don't want to abolish the European Union, not even now. Yeah. Whereas in France, the EU is a big cleavage. There have been big conflicts, and parties really have been having fights about that. Interestingly, the citizens in both countries are almost similarly critical. Whereas in Germany, they were not asked, and in France, they were asked. Obviously, they were asked. It was a referendum. So you have, let's say, 50% of the population that is EU critical in both countries. And the difference is that in France, you held a referendum, and in Germany, you didn't hold a referendum. And again, this is an argument that many of my colleagues have against politicization. Yeah, if we ask the citizens and the citizens have an opinion that we don't like, well, we might not like the outcome. That's it. It's also that in Germany, European integration is almost part of, here we go, national identity, which is related to the German post-war history. So Germany's only chance to become sovereign again was to become a part of the West. So obviously, European integration needs to be a part of German national identity, whereas in France, it's opposing. So France is an atomic power. France is a grande nation, and really to share sovereignty with the EU doesn't really fit with this narrative. Meaning that every debates on the EU before the 2005 discourse in Germany have been really harmonious, and in France it has been very conflicting. So always. So the 1992 Maastricht debate was equally as conflicting, and it went out very narrowly, but with a small support for the Maastricht Treaty. There's also this other history, because we almost missed having a European constitution in the 1950s with the European political community. And we didn't get the European political community because in France, the communists and the Gaullists, talking about left and right, voted against the Treaty on the European political community in the French National Assembly, 1956. So conflict on European integration have a tradition in France. Now, how did the French debate? They had as I said, a strong division between the yes motives and the no motives. And I really have assembled here the most decisive motives in the debate. On the yes side, there was a lot of meta-pragmatic arguments. We should vote yes because France has a responsibility, because France has a role in the world, because we need a strong Europe, because there's no alternative. So those were sort of empty arguments. Vote yes because it's better. Whereas the no motives were really very intelligently using established motives of the French political culture. And first of all, in France, there is a widespread criticism of what is called the elites. Yeah, so you see it whenever French farmers protest. It's the first time this year that we had farmers' protests of such an intensity in Germany. In France, it's not at all new. You have this since 40 years. So the French have a traditional mistrust against the political allies, and that was very successfully mobilized. And there was a new left movement, the so-called non de gauche, so the left no. So a lot of left-wing small parties, fringe parties, trade unions, etc., united. So it was a kind of a renaissance of a critical left. And they really successfully established motives of critique. against the constitutional treaty. And the most important motive, and I'm really convinced that it's the one that helped the no to win, was a criticism of the EU's neoliberalism, which is called ultraliberalism in France. So basically the argument was that the EU endangers France's welfare state, and it is neoliberal, and we have had enough of that. And that's why we vote no. Looking at the left-wing newspapers, it was really visible how this motive came up on the left and got rooted on the right by and by, and how it successfully used traditional concepts of the French political culture. How it was also strategically used by left and center-left actors, among others by a former prime minister, Laurent Fabius, who in that debate became a member of the Nom de Gauche. The social situation was very bad, unemployment was very high, so the population was very dissatisfied, so it like really helped to sort of anchor that motive. And if you look at the motives that decided the vote, so people were asked, why did you vote no? Then the most used argument was, I voted no because the social situation in France is too bad for a constitutional treaty. So the constitutional treaty would be negative for the employment situation in France, the economic situation in France is too bad, and the constitutional treaty is too neoliberal. Whereas the yes motive was really abstract, we need this constitutional treaty because it's necessary for European integration. Yeah, and in that case, as I said, so the no arguments apparently made it. And they made it in the discourse, and then it was reflected in the vote. In Germany, as I said, there was a lot of imported discourse. So Germany was discussing because France was discussing. The main finding really was this silencing strategy, and there also was some debate on Germany, but it wasn't really that decisive. So as I said, this silencing strategy thing really struck me. And it just means that if somebody criticizes the EU, so at that time it was, for instance, Peter Gauweiler, Christian social MP, who is a notorious EU critic. And he did sort of everything against the constitutional treaty. He even did a complaint against the constitutional court. So Peter Gauweiler did a complaint against the constitutional treaty before the German constitutional court. And upon that complaint, the German president stopped ratification of the constitutional treaty. What happened is that Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung had 10 lines on that, and Le Figaro had it on number 1, half the size. So if you were a German, you wouldn't even know that the ratification was stopped, except if you read those little notes. If you were a French and a conservative French, you would have known it immediately because it was the headline of Le Figaro. Germany stops ratification. Then obviously EU criticism was downplayed. So people publicly saying, okay, Gauweiler, nobody ever took Gauweiler seriously, forget about that, he's not important. And then if all this didn't help, there was an open threat with sanctions. So then a leading figure of the Christian Social Union, Edmund Stoiber, he says, okay, yeah, so we will have to remember voting behavior when it comes to the next lists. Yeah. It was like really, nobody reacted to voicing EU criticism. And that really, I mean, I really, until today, I don't really know what to do with it and what to make out of that finding. So in comparison, what we have is that sort of the two discourses when it comes to politicization, democratization, and EU identity have different, let's say, strengths and weaknesses. Because the German discourse was very open. The EU was constructed as us, but it was not very intensive. So it was a positive EU identity that was constructed, but not really that much democratic activity. Whereas the French discourse was very intensive, very politicized. There was a lot of citizen participation, but the French discourse was closed. France was us, the EU was constructed as them. And obviously, as I said, EU criticism won the discourse. Now, again, I think, I mean, when I get invited, for instance, by Pulse of Europe or by Europa Union, and when I say that this is a legitimate democratic decision, it's perfectly legitimate to create the EU, to criticize the EU treaty as it was. It is. Yeah. Just because the Germans didn't like the result, it's perfectly legitimate. That is what a vote is for. You are entitled to vote against the constitutional treaty when you think it's too neoliberal. It's not forbidden. It's a different thing. And it's not even anti-democratic. It's very democratic. It means I don't want that kind of a constitutional treaty. That thing is also very interesting. I did not much of quantitative studies, but that is very interesting. So the blue points are the French discourse. It's the number of articles per day that were published. And the pink one is the German. And you can see that the highlight of the peak of the German discourse is the French referendum. It's not the vote in the Bundestag. So that, I think, is a striking finding. In conclusion, a lot of findings. So a broad and intensive discourse in France, as opposed to the German discourse. Nevertheless, when it comes to demos building, the French discourse, both the French discourse and the German discourse until May, rather no. But because the French discourse constructed an opposition between France and the European Union. So that's not European identity. The German discourse after late May, rather a yes, because all the conditions sort of were there. And again, so European identity and EU democracy need to be distinguished here. So it can be sort of, the French discourse was, I think, really democratic, but nevertheless not constructing identity. So chances and limits of European identity formation that came out. Nevertheless, both discourses helped EU democratization, obviously. Construction of an open EU identification, bottom-up activity, etc., etc. It would be just nice to meet the conditions I set up in the beginning if they sort of would be happening together. So if citizens would identify more with the EU and be politicized and be democratically active, which is this bottom-up enhancement scenario that I described in the end. So unfortunately, the French discourse is an example of the bottom-up obstacle scenario. Yeah, a little bit like in the Brexit case. Citizens and activists politicize the EU, but engage with the EU in a critical or system-critical way. Bottom-up activities and politicization do not create EU support and may be directed against the EU or representative democracy as such. Unfortunately, as I said, the politicization not necessarily, democratization not necessarily creating identity. The German discourse is worse. It's an example, not of one of the scenarios, it's just an example of depoliticization, because the debate was stopped. Decisions were taken in parliament, but with as limited debate as possible. Maybe they hoped that the so-called permissive consensus would last. I mean, I don't know. In sum, there's no simple cause-effect model at work. So all those people that would ask me, where does European identity would come from, I will just receive the answer. It's very complex. A number of factors need to play together. Patterns of meaning are constructed. That's sort of the first condition. So there needs to be a discourse after all, meaning that the German discourse could barely construct European identity simply because it was barely existing. If you don't have a discourse, no construction of identity. Then, very interestingly, the Europeanization of national mediated public spaces, and that's sort of Muriel's topic in her dissertation, can take place, as in France, via national interests and national actors. So that's one vehicle of debating the EU, because I'm concerned, because I'm in French. The other way, as in Germany, via a European opening. So we are discussing about France because we are European citizens. Both are paths of a Europeanization. So in case we have both this, then in order to create European identity, at the end, there should be generally supportive identification that is constructed. So the minimum condition here is that the EU is seen as sort of us. So we are part of the European Union. It can be a critical us. It can be, I am a convinced European, but I don't like this constitutional treaty. Fair enough. Again, this is sort of what democracy is for. Yeah, but there needs to be some kind of identification. If the discourse constructs a clear distinction from other member states, then sort of it counteracts this idea of getting EU identity. So if exclusions are constructed, French but not European, or French but not German, or German but never with the French, that's sort of something plays against that. So some sort of positive relationship or constructive relationship needs to be constructed in the end. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you. And I was a little bit longer, sorry for that.
All right, thank you very much, Claudia. We have two discussants now before we open the floor for public discussions. Christiane Kuller, please go ahead.
So, hello, everybody, and thank you for the invitation and the chance of speaking with you, Claudia, on your new book, because I think this is a really interesting book and really important findings. And now we are almost 20 years after this, and we can also, and perhaps in the end, we can also have a look on the current situation and what is going on now, and what is different to 2005, and what is perhaps also similar. But I want to start with a quote. Martin Schulz, maybe you know the quote, the former president of the European Parliament, is known to have said, quote, if the EU were to apply for membership to the EU, it would be rejected, because the EU does not meet the democratic standards it demands of its own members. Yes, the democratic deficit of the European Union is on everybody's lips, especially now, shortly before the elections. I would like to offer a few thoughts here from a historical perspective, because I believe that historical hindsight can help to explain how the current situation came about. It points to how ambivalent the developments were and how fragile was what has been achieved. My thoughts are about the relation between democracy and EU in the past, and looking in the beginnings of the European unification. It shows that when the so-called coal and steel community, Montanunion, was founded in 1952, there was hardly any talk about democracy. On the contrary, the Montanunion coal and steel community was to be a depoliticized area of experts beyond the business of day-to-day politics. Efficiency was the highest value. There was an elitist understanding of politics, and this refers to a long tradition of solving economic problems in Europe since the 19th century. Europe was to be de-dramatized and depoliticized, quotations. The development of the European economy was not to be left to the whims of politics. And the question of democracy basically only entered the European institutions in the 60s and increasingly in the 70s and 80s, less with regard to its own institutions and more with a view to the countries that wanted to join the EU. The main concern was that future EU members should be democratic states. Historians see the applications of countries such like Spain, which was a fascist dictatorship under Franco, or Greece and Portugal. These applications as the most important driving force behind the debate on democracy in the EU. And the question of democratization within the EU only arose in the European institutions, only arose later. Initially, the EU's competences were strictly limited, and democracy did not seem necessary. This also corresponded to the cultural and political zeitgeist of the 50s and 60s. The question of the democratic legitimacy of European decisions only arose when the decisions became, and you said that, increasingly relevant to the everyday life of the people in the countries, in the member states, and especially since Maastricht. In summary, historians on the European history of European unification would probably say that the history of democracy and the European unification is not a bright story of modernization in which democracy was always present as a model and increasingly achieved in the time by time. In this respect, this is a very different history from that what the Western national states developed in Europe. Rather, it is a kind of alternative history of democracy. Another kind of history, an alternative history to the history of the national state democracy development in the second half of the 20th century. It is therefore a history that can possibly show us forms of democratic development that must had to function differently from a nation state democracy, and perhaps, and this is positive part of the conclusion, and perhaps this can provide helpful impulses for dealing with the crisis of democracy, which we have in the present also in the national states. And that perhaps we see ways out of the crisis of democracy on the European level that we can also use or have use from that on the national level. Following from this, I would like to formulate 3 questions that I would like to discuss as a context for your research findings you had in your new book. One important point is that there is no uniform demos at European level. And when you examine the thesis in your book about the extent to which Germans and French see themselves as Europeans, this ties in with the idea that sees the demos as an important starting point for democratization or core part of democratization of Europe. However, this cannot be a demos like a national demos. Europe is far too heterogeneous for that. So the question is, how can your research results be categorized? In your research findings, do you think the European demos as a kind of bigger nation? And to what extent are the ideas of identity that you have found conceived in terms of the national state? And to what extent do they refer to other references? And what are these other references? Okay, then the history, second context and question is, the history of the European unification points to alternatives, which are also addressed in the current elections. On the one hand, the European institutions are initially expert bodies that were supposed to make quick and rational economic decisions. They were supranational cooperations without any democratic, or at least without any democratic claim. And on the other hand, there is this ideal of EU as a democratic, legitimized organization with its demos. And what do your research findings say in this regard? Does the rule of the experts play a role in your findings in the articles? What model and vision do you find in your sources? Which models and visions are reflected in your in relation to the experts in your findings? And the third one, to look at those who do not identify with the EU. We also see at the European level now the opponents of Europe, they are organizing themselves democratically and pursuing illiberal policies with liberal instruments. You said you talked about the obstacle scenarios. You could say that they are using the democratic opportunities to undermine democracy. Or can you say this is a question? Huh? Some argue that this means that the opponents of democracy are now represented also on EU level. And looking on your results, I wonder, which demos is addressed by the opponents of Europe? And is this only against anti-European, anti-EU, or is it an idea of an autocratic EU? Is it a kind, as we see it on the national level at the moment? Is it solely a recourse to national identity? I think that was kind of, that was a core idea of the French no, this related to national identity, but perhaps there's also an anti-democratic opposition at EU level and function, I wonder if it functions similarly or differently to that on a nation state level. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I hope that I can make it brief. But first of all, thank you, Claudia, for an inspiring presentation, and thank you for sharing the book with us, which is also available as a open access publication. So we have to advertise that. Well, yeah. So, and for me, your book was a great reading material over my vacation and offered interesting and exciting new perspectives and facets on European studies, the EU, and the matters of democratization, politicization, and especially on identity formation while I was traveling, not in Europe, but a couple of miles away. But thank you for that. In my short comment, I want to briefly raise 4 rather loose points or remarks that came to my mind while reading the book. And before I delve into those points, I would like to make a short preliminary remark. A lot of you know me as the managing director of PARI, but my own academic education is rather interdisciplinary in European studies, American studies, and contemporary and diplomatic history. So I cannot clearly drop those interdisciplinary perspectives. So please bear with me if I'm not solely addressing perspectives as a historian, but also trying to interlink them. The focus on the 2005 EU constitutional treaty discussions in Germany and France is historically relevant as it marks a crucial moment in EU's political and institutional development. But to what extent did the failure of the constitutional treaty in 2005 had repercussions for EU integration and the direction of the EU when only a couple of years later the Lisbon Treaty became effective, minus the Charter on Basic Rights and the constitutional symbolism, but the text was almost identical to the original version? To what extent helped or hindered the label change with the Lisbon Treaty these processes of European identification and collective thinking, and this time without referenda in its member states, but ratified by the member states? What does these observations say about the quality of European democracy, and how did mechanisms of direct democracy and referenda play into that, and the process of European integration and Europeanization as such? In the year 2000, the former German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer raised the question of the finality in European integration, or a potential final state of integration and Europeanization. This was 4 years prior to the enlargement of the EU and its largest accession, and 5 years before the TCE failed by the French and Dutch referenda. Obviously, this retrospect offers a mere glimpse of a snapshot in time, which were overtaken by the events of the last 24 years and which overstrip this train of thought. Yet it highlights an interesting aspect in regards to Europe, the European Union, European integration, and thus the European identity. Analyzing the contrasting cases of France and Germany, Claudia's study reveals crucial aspects not only about the 2 member states, but also about Europe or the EU itself? While reading the book and listening to your presentation, I noticed 4 aspects and observations. First, identity formation. Defining the concept as such is complex, but the approach of linking micro and macro perspectives as well as patterns of identity formation in this multi-level analysis offers dense insights into the EU itself. However, and you also elaborate on that in the book, national contexts, and also on your presentation, national contexts are essential in order to better understand identity formation. Looking back into the past, and I'm stating the obvious here, pivotal moments in the history of the EU are almost always linked to its founding documents, such as the Treaty of Rome, institutional treaties, such as the Maastricht Treaty, or the enlargement in the 2000s. Those events were elite-driven, came from top down, and were rather highly technical, procedural, political matters. For a citizen, those events felt dry, distant, and unemotional, although they paved the way for an intricate, elaborate, and highly sophisticated project. So to what extent can a European identity be created when the emotional component is lacking? That is a crucial part in identity formation and creating a sense of belonging. In what respect is identity linked to or related also to territory, and what role plays a spatial dimension in a continent that had to keep up with the changing borders over the 20th century and tremendous transformation processes, especially since the end of World War II? And then what is the role of social media as part of a democratization process and identity formation, and what impact do social media platforms have on politicization of European politics and perceptions of the EU and its institutions? Is there a European public sphere that could contribute to European politicization and cross-border communication? And that brings me to the second point, and also to the very first 2 seminars that I took when I first enrolled in the European Studies program in Maastricht. And the courses were titled Idea of Europe and Bloody Diversity. So what is the idea of Europe? This question goes back to the very fundamental and underlying questions. What is Europe? What EU stands for? And you asked that question in the introduction of your book as well on page 7. What is the actual concept of Europe, and to what extent are EU and Europe used as identical terms, mainly in colloquial language? And what kind of means that also as an observation? And is a distinction between EU and Europe even necessary, and how is this linked to the formation of a European identity and European identification? The rhetoric of the official institutions of the EU is rather clear on those points. Yet again, this does not seem to go well with the public when the Commission is speaking about, quote, our democracy. Who is our? And is that our as citizens, or our as speaking as the EU policymakers, as the institutions and the whole apparatus behind it, or of the citizens itself? At the same time, it is important to acknowledge differences and diversity within Europe, with different traditions, histories, practices in the European Union, which is diverse and heterogeneous. Before even the practical ideas of the ECSC existed, different concepts of Europe across arose among intellectuals, writers, artists, philosophers, and political activists, particularly during the interwar period. After World War I, debates about Europe proved to be more tangible. However, one coherent and consistent idea did not exist. Notions such as a League of Nations failed. And probably even today, one could not find a homogeneous idea of Europe, but potentially rather ideas in plural that shape and define Europe. Which leads me to my third point, national contextualization. When seeking European identity formation, the context of Europe's member states are a key aspect in its highly multifaceted question. I would argue that European identity and national discourses are interlinked and interwoven. The national context, political traditions, and practices create its own dynamics that interconnect within member states itself, but also in the dense and complex chains at local, regional, national, inter, and supranational levels, with its own histories, experiences, complexities, influences, and impacts. Therefore, historical contextualizations and problematizations and embedding those questions into its time and context are essential feature to better understand, for example, why the French referendum failed in 2005. In this regard, I would like to ask, rather content-related, how far does the fact that a referendum in France and the decision of the Bundestag and Bundesrat in Germany shape the research question of your study and the respective national discourses? In other words, in France, the public voted on the treaty, while Germany, the elected elite, decided in favor of the treaty. And that, interestingly enough, as a side note, certain aspects of your findings go very well with parts of my aspect of my dissertation, especially when it comes to the French sovereignty and also to the German aspects, such as, we call it silencing. In my thesis, I'm talking more about the so-called wait and see attitude in Germany, but I think that interestingly links those political traditions. And then, and how far are these differences related to questions and practices of democracy and thus democratization within the EU? Since the EU faces the dilemma of how to consider national interests and motivations, simultaneously how to consider the interests of candidates and potential candidates, while matters at European and international levels are urgent, decision-making processes are lengthy, and actions, reactions, or responses seem heavy-handed. Subsequently, the fourth point that I want to raise highlights the international dimension of European integration and Europeanization. The EU reforms, questions of liberal democracy for candidate countries, for example, general questions of democracy and the democratic deficit are still ongoing and being processed within Europe. To what extent can one interpret the discourses on European integration and Europeanization as increasing importance of the European Union? And in what regard is a confident self-image needed within the process of Europeanization, European identification, and identity formation? The process or the processes are and cannot be linear and do not follow along geographic borders. And as you said, also in your presentation, they are in flux and socially constructed. At the same time, this does not only include Europe itself, but goes further. Therefore, the macro perspectives are as crucial as the micro perspectives, but particularly in an increasingly interwoven world. The role of Europe in the world and perspectives on Europe play an important aspect in this nexus, looking at current geopolitical challenges and the need for fast political answers. Could thus the recent discourses on enlargement build momentum on European integration, democracy, and democratization? And recent developments such as Brexit, the financial crisis, the migration crisis, but also the Russian invasion into Ukraine pose manifold challenges to Europe, also challenging the process of European identification, while at the same time populist Eurosceptical voices are getting louder. In post-Brexit dynamics, external challenges and rising national populist politics at national and European levels, it seems to get windier and more turbulent, not only in Brussels, but all around Europe and its neighboring states. Therefore, I would agree with your closing remarks, and I quote, "Democracy rather depends on critical, informed, and engaged citizens This means that both social science and EU studies and the EU, its politicians, and its institutions should welcome politicization and EU criticism as part of the necessary democratization of the EU. So I would agree with that, but I also would go maybe a little further in saying or adding not only EU science and social sciences, but other academic disciplines and interdisciplinary efforts, and then going even further beyond the academic and political realms. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I have time for a reply, and we shouldn't be forgetting that maybe some other people would want to ask a question. So I try to be brief, which is almost impossible. First of all, thank you. I mean, I think this is like really something to be continued, and I think it's really a great example of what well, interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity can contribute. So let me start with Vivian's last point. Yes, obviously, not only EU studies, but also other disciplines. Yeah. The first time I discussed this book was at UCL in London at our new Cooperation Partners institution, the European and International Social and Political Studies Department. Historians, philosophers, geographers, political scientists, sociologists, and it was just great. It's usually very boring to discuss this only with political scientists, but because they don't understand half of what is at stake, because the historical dimension and all that is missing. Okay, now coming to the questions. I tried to say briefly something on on those points that you raised. So first of all, I think, is identity something like a national identity, and is Europe like a nation state? I think I have made it sufficiently clear that both times no. I think that when sort of the classical Europa Union people would ask you, they think of something like a national identity. So for a long time, it used to be a question in the questionnaires, would you be ready to go to war for Europe? I think this is a very ancient idea of national identity. So we are not after something like a national identity. And the European Union is not something like a nation state. It's something else. And that's what makes it so complicated. So we are after how national identifications and European identifications relate. This is why I came up in the end with these complex entanglements of relationships and conditions that sort of need to be met. Yeah. Because it's, as you can say, it's not like really, I mean, the French can in discourse construct themselves, obviously, as whatever they want. It's just that for European identity, it's not actually meeting the conditions. When they say, for us is France and not Europe, and Europe is the other. Because if the French say Europe is the other, then they sort of say it doesn't concern us. If something doesn't concern me, I don't even have to go to vote in the European elections because I'm not concerned, because it's something out of my realm. So that would sort of be the basic thing. So in that case, the Germans are like really, how could I say that? So in that case, I think the development is more advanced in Germany, because the Europe would really be seen much more as us than in France. Yeah, whereas the Germans are not used to debating about the European Union. So what I can then maybe say is that when you add this next level of identity, then you have really more complex entanglements between identities. And they are not neither positive nor negative, but they can interrelate in multiple ways. So you have more possibilities of combining them. That I think is my answer, trying to be brief in a very big question. Then rule of experts. Yes, of course, the EU is tremendously expert-oriented. And I think this is what influences this take on EU politicization as being dangerous. Because what do citizens do? Well, they stop experts from governing. So they ask nasty questions. They don't like bureaucracy. And the EU is tremendously bureaucratized. Jean Monnet was a super bureaucrat and technocrat. There was no idea of democracy. They wanted to do something against citizens. There are even quotes that underline that. And they wanted to do something without the citizens. And I think this is sort of speaking normatively, being 3 or 4 weeks before the European election. This is really something that we, as Europeans, as EU researchers, as academics, as citizens, need to leave behind. So Europe cannot be top down. I think we really see that. It's not a surprise because no democracy can be only top down. Yeah, this is what I mean. You cannot just say, can you please go and do democracy, and then not accept that democracy has a bottom-up component. Democracy needs a bottom-up component. Which brings me to Christiane's third point. Yes, I know this argument. I really know this argument. I get it like regularly. Are you really in favor of EU politicization? Look at what the right-wing populists do. They are in the European Parliament. I even have some colleagues who say, do you really want more competences for the European Parliament? Imagine the right-wing people have a majority in the European Parliament, and then you have more competences in the European Parliament. Oh my God. Yeah. So my brief answer is that the fight against anti-democrats is not one that will be won by limiting institutional competences, and it's not one that will be won by limiting politicization. I think there is something like a right to democratic self-defense. So there is a lot of debate in political theory about that, meaning that obviously at some point limits need to be set. So if people that are fighting against representative democracy use representative democracy only to abolish representative democracy, there is sort of a debate about Thuringia and the Constitutional Court and all that, then obviously democracy needs to defend itself. So at some point we need sort of interdictions, at some point we need laws. But it's not by limiting democracy itself that we will win, in my opinion, against right-wing populists. And it's really, again, it's a tricky one. And then you said which demos is addressed by the right-wing EU critics. And I think that's a very, very interesting question, because I think it's a narrative, it's a populist narrative of autocracy and the real people. So like the real people, they want the real things. And it's not only on democracy, it's on the common sense. So real people have a common sense. Really, a very nice example of that is this election slogan of Alternative for Germany of the last Hessen federal state elections. Keine Heizung ist illegal. No heating is illegal. Yeah, that takes up a left slogan and turns it in favor of AfD, and it turns it against the German government, who wanted to exchange heatings at that moment. And it appeals to the common sense. Why should I exchange my heating if it works? Just because Robert Habeck has the idea I should be exchanging that? No, I don't want that. So a lot of the right wing plays on such a kind of appeal on something that they think is common sense, and they construct a real people, us, like the normal people, like the heterosexual people, also like the sort of a patriarchal idea of society. This is, I think, very much under discussed, but a lot of the right-wing discourse goes along with a lot of misogyny. So women are best when they are at home, they should raise children, etc. Maximilian Krahs, the notorious head candidate of Alternative for Germany, he does videos on TikTok. So he's extremely clever, saying, hey, if you are a boy and you didn't have a girlfriend, vote for AfD, then you are a real man, and the problem with the girls is settled. Yeah, so what is that? I mean, that's kind of a Putin light, sorry, but a kind of a narrative of you know, strong men against weak women. So I think there are also cross-cutting issues of autocratic narratives outside Europe. One of my more recent research topics is that I don't think that threats to democracy are only outside Europe, they are inside Europe. So let me say a little bit about the upcoming EP elections, because there is a preparation. So the European People's Party, so the moderate conservatives, they clearly plan to be collaborating with the European conservatives and reformists. For instance, Viktor Orban. Yeah. So they are clearly going to the right. Now, I mean, there is, you know, she is in Identity and Democracy. So there are two right-wing groups. So there is Identity and Democracy, and that's like the really hard right-wing people, and there is conservatives and reformists, and that's a little bit less right-wing. But they are clearly planning to find majorities really on the very right, excluding only the extreme right. We will see how long that holds. So clearly the danger is not just coming, the danger is not politicization here in that point. On Vivian's points, Let me say a few words on Lisbon, even though that wasn't like really your question, but I think that's an example. So when the constitutional treaty was not ratified because of the negative referenda, they returned to the business as usual. So they returned to the technocratic allied-driven way that has always worked. So they did a parliamentary ratification. They didn't take up the justified criticism. So what does this say about EU democracy? It says we have much of a top-down expert Europe. And I think that's the problem. On identity formation, I think I said a lot about that when I answered to Christiane's first question. Then what is the idea of Europe? Who is the our in our democracy? I mean, I really would love to have a discussion on ancient ideas on European integration, but we cannot do that. We will do that over dinner. But who is the our in our democracy? Well, it must be the EU citizens, obviously. If we are speaking about representative democracy, then we are speaking about a sovereign, and then the sovereign needs to be the demos, and that needs to be the citizens. Now, it's very tricky in the European Union who actually is this demos. And I'm not going to raise that question, just to visit to say that there are people in this room who are not EU citizens. And it means I have to battle with Ausländerbehörde regularly, and they become my most hated enemies because I cannot even pay a honorarium, even if I have the budget to do that, because there is a long bureaucratic thing at stake there. Yeah. So I think there are really some issues that need to be resolved and that are not very pragmatic. So the question is open, but that's open in any sort of polity. Yeah. It's a question that is open in Germany. There are different sort of nationality laws, so it's really an open question. Who is the us? On the national contextualizations, I would just say yes. Yeah. So there is a different political culture, a different system in France. And I think that the point that you made is that the political system and the political processes go along with the political culture, and that sort of really enforces one another. And I think that's sort of the really, really interesting point, how the political culture plays into the system and vice versa. Yeah, so on the last point, increasing importance, EU enlargement, all those new topics, that's again a tricky one. Because I think it's really tricky, because I think the EU faces a lot of challenges. If you have a referendum on EU enlargement and Ukraine accession, I don't think, honestly, Ukraine would become an EU member. I don't think that would work. If sort of you have a kind of top-down induced EU enlargement, sort of pressurizing Ukraine to become an EU member, I don't think that would be very beneficial for citizen support in the EU, because you can only go to such a point in sort of getting citizens to blindly follow what the allies tell them. Then if this means we stop EU enlargement, that's also a tricky one, because we are not like alone in the world. There are sort of some problems that are at stake. So let me sort of conclude with a question mark, that I think that the EU faces a lot of challenge, a whole of a lot of challenges, and it faces a lot of democracy issues, and I don't think it gets easier with the challenges it has ahead.
All right, thank you very much for these very great discussions and your responses. I think we still have, how much time do we still have?
Well, if we go 90 minutes, we are at the end. But if we want to give the audience the chance to ask some questions, we can.
Okay, then maybe let's just open the floor. And do you? Okay, thank you. Matthias.
Thank you so much. I think you wanted to show us now this logic of you are the experts and we are the people. We can listen but are silent, right? So, okay, that worked. I wanted to say many things, but first of all, simply there's the EU election now, and I can only vote for German parties. So, so obviously there's no demos, and also the EU has no idea or no interest in building European parties, for example. The second thing, which is maybe a little bit more important is, or I think theoretically. So I think every three of you have this picture still in mind of there was this nation state time, and now there's like EU, whatever, global time. And so it's clear if we talk about nation states and what the nation is and what the demos in the nation state is, but there's no European country disconnected from the European development, right? Especially with respect to there being nation states. So most of the European nation states weren't nation states in that version before the Second World War, and also before the European integration started. And this is especially true for the Central Eastern European membership states. They were many things, but not nation states before that. So there is this development, and you mentioned the idea of the imagined community. That exactly was the question of Benedict Anderson. Why do countries who are left out of colonial power, of imperialist superstructures, turn afterwards not into a communist, beautiful people-ruled states, but turn into nation states and want to die for their countries? That was the question Benedict Anderson raised initially. So maybe we should take him a little bit more serious in this kind of co-development of European Union and the nation states in Europe. So, and that's why, again, so Europe is represented by national parties and by the German bureaucracy, because you simply can't go to the European bureaucracy anywhere. You can just go to the European showrooms, you know? So, for example, in Berlin, and it's very funny there. But if you need a passport, you have to go to your own bureaucracy, which is not European, or it doesn't show itself in European. So I would really put that in to think not about there's a contrarian development, or we knew everything about the nation state, because we simply think wrongly about how nation states evolved and still evolve in combination to European Union. And one last short thing. I would really very much agree with you when you say, okay, if it's a democracy, democracy means always also opposition. And then not only critique, but also this hard kind of fight. So, but if we really agree on this kind of definition of democracy, at some point we will have to stop saying there's a good and a bad opposition. Then there's an opposition and there's competition, and then we have to find good reasons also as scientists for the bright side of life and against maybe the populist side, because honestly, it doesn't make sense for me to say there is a bad opposition, which is not an opposition, but it's the devil himself. Thank you.
All right. Looking at the time, I would say we collect a second question. Yeah, please.
Claudia, congratulations, first of all, on the book. Really interesting. I want to make two quick points. One, I believe Vivian's point, I think that she made about the fact that it was an actual referendum in France, where it was if I understood correctly, in Germany, it was the parliament, right, that voted. Shouldn't that mean that it makes sense to look at the newspapers in France, but because every citizen would have a say? But in Germany, why look at the newspapers? Because wouldn't it make more sense to look at, I don't know, the discussions in the parliament or something like that, or if the citizens were writing to their elected representatives in the parliament, rather than look at the newspapers? This is from a methodological point of view, and I really like that comment. The other aspect that I noticed in the presentation was the level of Germanness and Europeanness. And I think maybe if you want to keep working on this project, looking at maybe at the Treaty of Maastricht, and comparing this exact same things, France and Germany, and the discourse, how was it in France, how was it in Germany? Because I would expect Germanness to be higher at that point, because it's right after the reunification, right? Maybe, and the Europeanness is not that, it hasn't been that long, right? And does that make a difference? Are we still us, is still us Europe, right? In the case of Germany, and how does that change the findings, if it does at all? These are my two questions, but I think this Germanness, Europeanness, and the impact on the citizens' involvement can be traced in other settings too, because obviously the European Parliament elections being one of them. Thanks.
One more, or do you want to react to these two now? You decide.
Thanks, Claudia. It was very interesting, and I haven't had the chance to read the book yet, so this just thumbed a little bit through the pages, so this might be the reason for my misunderstandings, but I would sort of go in the same direction as Vivian and as your remark. Are you really looking for an European identity as a prerequisite for democracy? And a demos in a substantial way? I mean, some lawyers would argue this, constitutional lawyers, but in your book, you have also this Grimm and Habermas debate in the 1990s and early 2000s or so. But the real question was for Habermas and Grimm, the question of European democracy is a question of whether we have a European public sphere or not. I mean, this is sort of the essential question. And then, of course, we don't have a European public sphere in the sense, for reasons you have described as well. And but in moments of crisis, sometimes this pops up, like in the French referendum. And this is why it is obvious that in these situations, you have peak in the newspapers everywhere, in the German newspapers, Spanish, and so forth. If it's a crisis element, then you have sort of some form of a public sphere. And the same was also true, not with the German parliamentary decision, because this is routine, but for example, when the German Constitutional Court decided 2012 in the debt crisis. And they sort of, I was in Paris at this time, and there was a live ticker set up in every cafe, whether they stopped now the help for Greece or not. And this was sort of all over the place, and everybody was discussing this thing. So the German Constitutional Court has a mechanism of creating a European debate, very punctual, well, but there was a big debate, and not about what the French Parliament said. So you have some illusions of a European public sphere in times of crisis, I would say. Or can you say that? This would be my question.
Okay, so I'll start with Jörn's questions. I won't go into why European identity and not rather public sphere. I think I sort of explained in the first 10 minutes why European identity. There is some part on the EU public sphere in the book. And I think you're right. So, and I think this is what I saw in the study is an example of debates of a Europe-wide impact helping to create an EU public sphere. Yeah. So I think it's an interesting case in that respect. But then I would put it like more ironically, I think when it comes to public spheres, we have other problems than just whether we have national public spheres. We have a separation of public spheres, also within the nation states. So now, today, I would say that the question is no longer whether we get a European public sphere, but whether we get a public sphere at all, which then can be Europeanized. Because people go on TikTok, people go on Twitter. So my daughter, for instance, told me that she has kids in her class that don't read any newspapers and they don't look at any news media when they want to learn something about something that happens. They look on TikTok or on Instagram. Okay, I wasn't going to say that. I wasn't going to say that. So yeah, but I mean that's obviously not what Habermas or Grimm would have considered an EU public space. Yeah. So on the one hand, I think that it's those EU-wide events that trigger that. And what the example, I love the example that you gave. This is very much what I saw here. And my argument would be, coming back to European identity, obviously this only works because people know that it concerns them. Why is there a live ticker in French cafes? Because they know it concerns us. So it doesn't concern the French, it concerns Greece. So why do the French want to know what happens to Greece? Because the German Constitutional Court decides something. It's a prime example of a European public space. And it only works because even the cafe owners in Paris know that this is important and it will interest people. So what I mean is that it builds on this sort of basic EU identity. That sort of would be my maybe unsatisfactory answer, but that's as a kind of first thing. Then Alex, it's very interesting. So I have somewhere in the book, there is a table on identifications. Yeah, that shows that over the years, German citizens are as much EU identified as the French or not. And they even are like indeed a little bit less over times, feeling as EU citizens than the French. It doesn't reflect in the discourse, or it didn't reflect in the discourse because, as Vivian said, the German citizens weren't asked. So this feeling of the EU is not me or is not us was not reflected. Nobody asked them. That's the thing, sort of top-down democratization and top-down identity. And that it really needs to, there needs to be a kind of emotional component. And this is why I said that I don't think a top-down induced enlargement or anything will carry us very far when there is not a kind of emotional component or conviction of the citizens behind that. Because there's a limit on how far you can go. Well, there's those categories by David Easton that I love because they are so illustrative, identification and support. Yeah, so you need a basic identification and a basic citizen support, and that can be quantified. And if you stretch this too far, and if citizens decide I'm not heard, I'm not listened to, I don't like the system's output, then they will go down. And I think this is sort of the danger that we face. Yeah. And coming back to Matthias's point, let's discuss about this nation state, EU, and whatsoever development, because I think that's really an interesting argument. I have the hunch that you are probably right. You're always right. If I want to enter into my office again, I have to say this now. No, but most often we agree also. No, but you are probably right, and I never thought about this in these terms. So it's really, really interesting. So the argument to say that what if a nation state is more a kind of a dynamic thing, and sort of it's not the development of the nation states, but it's a development of EU and nation states in relation. I think this also opens up very different perspectives on the questions of identity formation. But let me close on this question of the enemies of democracy, because I really think it's very vital. And I would say that the judgment that one can have on that is a normative one, because in the end, you face the question whether you should limit democracy at some point. Yeah. So do we want to stop people from expressing opinions, whatever these opinions are, because we deem these opinions are anti-democratic? There are very different rules. So they are relatively strict in Germany. In the US, you can basically say anything legally. Yeah. And the idea behind is always a democratic one. So in the US, you can basically say whatever you want because free speech is valued so highly, like theoretically, legally, not in many Ivy League universities, but legally, yes. In Germany, you cannot say whatever you want because there are, with good reasons, limitations, legal limitations. And the idea again behind that is democratic self-defense. The limits for where the democratic self-defense starts can be different ones, but they need to be negotiated. But I think what is clear is that no one is in the position to decide who are the good Democrats, because there are sort of pretty objective criteria of what is democratic or anti-democratic. So for instance, a party that goes against a plurality in the party system and would like to abolish the plurality of parties in Germany with a unity party, or a party that would want to abolish certain basic rights as they are fixed in the constitution, would be considered as anti-democratic, as sort of per definition of many political scientists and of many legal scholars. Yeah. Then you can say that's a subjective decision. Okay, agreed. It's a normative judgment. But sort of it underlines that. But really the one thing that doesn't work is, and here I think I refer to your experiences in your free speech seminar, the one thing that surely doesn't work is to say, this opinion must not be voiced because I don't like it. There's no such authority. Yeah. So I think that in a democracy, the only barrier that we can have is a legal barrier in terms of democratic self-defense. And then where you said this legal barrier is contested for good reasons. And I mean, I don't have the answer. The only answer that sort of I have personally is that I think there is good reason to set the barriers where really people use democracy to dismantle democracy. Also wo Demokratie benutzt wird, Demokratie abzubauen. And there is a danger that this will happen in Thuringia. That sort of that there will be a government that is so right-wing that it will destroy the independence of the Constitutional Court, for instance. And that for me would be a clear moment of saying, okay, so here we should step in before that. Because what comes out in the end is nothing to do with representative democracy. We don't want that. Yeah. But it really, I mean, it's disputable. It's disputable. It's a kind of a normative decision on where we discuss the books. Thank you.
Right. Do we finish it here, or do we get that? I have a question. Can I still ask a question?
Of course you can.
Yes, please. You start then.
To the questions. One thing is about the public sphere, the European public sphere, and also the question of the parties, on the European level. I have much sympathy for these ideas, but I think this is not the whole picture. Because this is these are the ideas for kind of elite, for the, wie heißt das, die everywheres und die also for the global people, global thinking people, international thinking people, and they say, great, let's create a big sphere of communication in the whole Europe in mostly English, but all languages, of course. And if you try to reach. But I think the European idea has to reach the other people also, and there I'm not sure how to create a public sphere which can manage both. The example you spoke about is very interesting, because I think this could work, but I'm not sure if it works. If it is the right way to say, let's create a public sphere in the European dimension. The other point is looking back to the history of the nation states in Europe, the Western nation states, and after 1990 the Eastern nation states. I think if you look on the development, you see, yes, the democratization of the states is connected with the European connections and with the development of the European Union, but you don't need democracy on the European level for that. You can make that with treaties, and they did it in the beginning. And the Montanunion, I think in the beginning, it's the very first beginning of the Montanunion, coal and steel union, is very interesting, because this is not between two countries, France and Germany, which are decide to make a treaty. These are the most hated countries each other. They were Erbfeinde. This was not only the idea of a economic coming together and finding a better solution, but this is also coming cultural together. And I think this is an example how it worked to if two countries decide to work together because they have common interests, and these were the coal and steel interests. And I think that could be an idea which we could have today also, and we could try to find examples like that. Where do we have common interests? Where is it good is it good working together and not only giving up your identity, your French identity, when you decide to go to a European election, or ratifies a treaty, a European treaty. Okay, these were my 2 points.
Okay, thank you. And one more. Okay, maybe a bit of a provocation, but the history of modern state theory didn't start with Locke, but with Hobbes, and not with participation, but with outcome. So by providing security, legitimacy is used, and the demos is sort of erected out of nothing. Now, I don't really want an EU that is taking Hobbes as a guideline, but Benedict Anderson also was talking a lot about how certain measures were necessary for an imagined community even to be possible. So like standardization of language, newspaper, print, and a sort of whole infrastructure that had to be developed top-bottom for a bottom-up to be even possible. So isn't that a false duality to only focus on democracy as participation? And maybe the French saying no was less about we want to participate and more about these experts are bad. We don't want that. So Europe doesn't fail on participation, but on outcome. And isn't that sort of a point talking about when we talk about identity and legitimacy and so forth? Last.
Yeah, I wanted to go into the same direction, also with your idea of identity, or as it was mentioned today, it was more about, so I am influenced by the European Union, so I have an interest, I should have an interest, or I should see my interest in participating in it, and then maybe I find some like-minded people, and together we are building a party or a NGO or something, and we're trying to influence or participate in democracy. And then, but that is a very kind of an interest-based idea of participating in it. And for example, then the French would be kind of Realitätsverweigerer. They don't see how it would be in their interest to be active, but also kind of refusing it. And in that case, but also in general, well, we are in the European Union, so the European politics are influencing us, so we should make that our interests are also kind of represented, seen, and etc. And but also with identity, and of course, then we are all going back again to the national identity as a kind of a blueprint, or as a kind of a early version of it, that kind of there's also at least the idea that is also contained in that us, a kind of a solidarity. And so when you say, for example, that German elites are kind of identifying with the European Union, but then there is a kind of an maybe a kind of a obvious lack of kind of solidarity with other European citizens, for example, the Greeks after the financial crisis and etc. So I think that is kind of that identity without solidarity, and also with the kind of that the European Union is also kind of providing something like a security, or also social security, and so I don't have a really good argument to bring everything together, but I think you get in what direction I want to go. Also, of course, that the European Union is also heavily the idea of competition between states is also, for me, isn't a very good framework where you can really get to kind of solidarity. I guess what I would like if there were a European Union identity as well. So maybe more obstacles on a more kind of a critique on a kind of a very reduced kind of liberal idea of identity, so to speak.
Last words.
Yeah, brief concluding words. So basically, to Tom, yes, of course. It is about protection. It is about security, and I think if we look at what happens at the European borders, we see how this manifests in today's EU. Yeah. Second point, output. Of course, I think I really said that. Yeah. So I didn't. Actually, I did the contrary of criticizing the French for doing what they did. I think the French acted perfectly reasonable. So they debated the constitution, They didn't like the constitution. There was one argument that said it's not even a constitution because it has 2 times the word democracy and 72 times the word common market. So it's not a constitution. Yeah? So that's a fair argument. It's one of the best arguments that I heard about judging a constitution. So the French, well, basically they were like really even rational choice citizens. They looked at the constitution, they decided they didn't like it, they voted against because they were not satisfied with the policy output. So my argument, I think, rather is sort of the contrary of what you were insinuating. It's like really we need to see that Europe concerns people's everyday life. Output counts, and a lot of people are not satisfied with the output of the European Union for various reasons. It has a lot to do with social Europe being weakly developed. This is why I think the French and the majority rejected the constitutional treaty, because they were not satisfied with policy output. So I think it sort of must not be underestimated. So I was not, it's just that sort of I was following this path of democratic practice. I wasn't saying that democratic practice is alternative to support or to output or something like that. It was just that sort of I was after, and I investigated, among other things, how that sort of democratic practice is triggered. Yeah. And I think that sort of the French, again, did exactly what you said. So they considered their interests, they considered the treaty, and in consideration of both of them, they said, no, sorry, but this is not what we expect an EU treaty to be. So I think it's very important when it comes to, maybe that's a nice concluding word. So what can we learn from this debate? I think the German way really is not the way to go. This top-down thing, silencing the debate, everything will work out and shut up. And it's Matthias's argument. It's every criticism in Germany, you must not criticize the EU. You would be surprised, or maybe not, how many people are shocked when I criticize the EU. I have been a Jean Monnet chair for 4 years. Some people think I'm not supposed to criticize the EU because they pay me. And then I sort of go about criticizing democracy in the EU, and the classical Europe direct would be, but what, why is she criticizing the EU? And I mean, they sort of, I criticize the EU because this is democracy. So I considered it, I don't say abolish the EU, but I think it's okay to criticize the EU. So I think that is sort of the crucial thing. So I think the French, in a way, were like absolutely right. It's only that then, unfortunately, if you ask the citizens for their opinions, it might be they come up with an opinion that is not the one the Allies want. But this is, again, what democracy is about. Which brings me back to these EP elections. So there will be an outcome that many in this room won't be exactly too happy about it. Yeah, but once again, I think this battle needs to be won elsewhere. And part of this battle is really related to what concerns citizens. Why are they concerned? What is it that they don't like about the European Union? What can be learned from the French debate on the constitutional treaty? Because I think there are a lot of lessons that can be learned, also from the Brexit debate. So I think we should really inquire into what are the populist arguments against the EU and what truth is in those populist arguments, because there is a lot of truth. And then we would have a path on how to remedy the EU's policy output. And with that, I think we can, thanks a lot. That was tremendously interesting.